I think somewhere along the line, I learned that it was not okay to be angry and to be the good girl, right? And the rule follower. And I know a lot of people get that message. Unpacking that in poetry has been, baby steps for me. I have not gone, full on into that. But I do think that it can be a stumbling block, right? The fear of being judged, right, by what you're putting down on the page. That, like you said, that's not right to do. That's not the story.
Welcome to Wild News, a healing artistic space for creative souls. And today I'm chatting with Dawn Lease, aka the Hammock Writer, author of 3 published collections of poetry, as well as a writing coach. Dawn, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for the invite. I'm so excited to talk, and I love that it's called Wild Muse. So that's wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. When I came up with the name, in fact, it's making me think of the story that you shared about coming up with the Hammock Writer. Like when it dropped in, I was just like, yes, that's right.
Yes. Yeah. That's how I felt. Yeah. It's just like, you just know, right? It's just a knowing. It's a feeling, and it's like spot on. Let's move forward with it.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Dawn, I wanted to start today by chatting about the writing process. So really putting your writing coach hat on.
Okay.
So the writing process, but particularly when it comes to fear, I've heard you say that when we recognize our fears, that can be really helpful to move through them. And so I'd love you to expand on that with regards to the writing process. Like if someone is afraid of showing up in that regular way, how can recognizing their fears help?
Yeah. I think in my personal experience, and then working with other people and just having, lots of friends who are writers, I think when you recognize the fear, it takes some of its energy away. It doesn't make it go away. And it's not to say that we shouldn't fear things, because I think fear is a natural human emotion that I think our society often tries to get us to kind of tamp down. And, it's there for a reason. It's there to keep us safe sometimes, right? But other times it can be something that holds us back. So when it's something that's holding us back in the writing process, I think recognizing it and just seeing it for what it is helps you move beyond. And I think sometimes in order to kind of work through the fear, like writing, and writing in terms of journaling, in terms of brainstorming, just to get that feeling and those ideas out of your head. If you have people who you're close to, a writing group where you can verbally share it, I think that just kind of takes the air out of it oftentimes. And then you can kind of create your own relationship with whatever fear it is, the fear of showing up to the blank page, the fear of being somebody reading something that's really, close and personal to your heart. You can kind of decide how you're going to approach that relationship as you continue through your writing journey.
That's so interesting what you said about taking the energy away when you recognize it. Like I really get that sense of the difference between having it in this kind of private space that you're just experiencing where the pressure can feel really great, and then setting it out there, either like sharing it with someone or sharing it on the page. It kind of eases that pressure.
I think so. And I think especially when you share it with somebody else, there's just that opportunity for them to be like, well, I feel like that 9 out of 10 times I sit down to write, right? So sometimes it can become this communal fear where it's like, okay, well, we all fear this particular part of the writing process. How can we help each other? Can we text each other? Can we meet either in person or online and do like a creative writing meetup? So there's different ways that you can kind of work through that. Because, when we sit with our fear alone, right, it can just really kind of blossom, right, and become bigger and bigger and bigger, where it does kind of just stop us and be like, okay, well, if I'm going to be scared, then I'm not going to do that, right? So, and I think this is often overused, but it's just like the do it afraid kind of phrase is like, okay, we're going to recognize it, we're going to honor it, but let's see how we can move through it. with it, instead of just making it like, okay, I'm never going to write again. This is the end for this fear.
And also, when you're talking about that sort of sitting with it alone versus sharing it with someone, it feels to me, when I'm in a state of fear and I'm not sharing it, I'm really validating that fear, because if I keep it silent, then I'm adding shame onto the mix, and I'm essentially telling myself, this is real because you're choosing not to say anything about it. And it's like, it's personal and I'm the only one who's got it. And that makes me a really bad person.
Right.
Versus the moment I share it, and like you say, 9 times out of 10, the person I share it with is like, oh yeah, I have that too. I find in that moment, I kind of get a sense of, maybe this fear like isn't real, isn't personal, but just something we're all like erroneously carrying and like believing, like we've all fallen for it.
Exactly. I like that. We've all fallen for it, because I think that's what happens, right? You hear other narratives about it, and so then you just kind of take that on as your own. And I think that, again, sharing it is just a good way to kind of like release that tension of it. And again, not to say, oh, never, you should never fear, never. Well, because we all fear. It's like, it's part of, life, but it's how we navigate it and go, through it and around it and weave into it. That can sometimes also lead to very beautiful writing, and very honest writing as well.
Yeah. You mentioned this idea of, okay, we can talk to someone, we can also show up and work through that fear on the page. I want to just go into that a little bit more, because like, I'm all for that, Dawn. For me, I find journaling incredibly therapeutic. And I also know in my past that I've been in places where I've been so afraid that I've avoided that blank page like it's going to kill me.
Right.
And I know for you've shared recently that you're working on a new collection and you're really exploring some quite personal content. And you've often said, like, I don't want to write this. And yet you keep showing up to the page. So I'd love for you to explain to someone who's in that place of like, Dawn, I'd love to show up to the page and explore my fear on it, but I can't even get near to the page.
Mm-hmm. I think what is helpful to me, because really, I mean, I write poetry. There is a lot of my personal history in my poetry. There's a lot of my family and my friends. My family does joke about like, oh, Dawn's in the room, be careful what you say, because you just never know where it's going to end up. And but this in particular, this new collection is really personal for me. And so what I decided to do when I decided that I was going to start writing these poems was just pretend like nobody was ever going to read them. And to me, that was just something simple. It's like, okay, in my mind, I'm thinking you're working on another collection. You're working on another publication that's going to go out to the world. Like, what if you just write these stories from your perspective, and like nobody else is going to read them? And then it took a little bit more of that fear away, because it's like, well, if nobody else is going to read them, then I can be really honest in these messy, rough first drafts, right? And then I can make the choice as the writer to edit some of that out or to fictionalize it as I go through the revision process. So I think writing like nobody is ever going to read it has been super helpful to me with some of these poems.
I can so relate to that, and how important it is to have that kind of miniature discussion with yourself. Like, I actually do that when I get scared about doing this podcast. Like, I'll find myself getting nervous about doing the recording, and then I'll think to myself, oh my God, is anybody going to watch this video? But yeah, that's the place where I'm sort of, it's like my attention's out there. I might be comparing myself to other people. I might be worrying about not being good enough. But then when I remind myself, hey, you just do this because you love having these conversations, then I feel differently about it.
I love that you point that out, because I love telling stories. I've loved writing. I mean, since I was young, like I've been writing stories since I think I started writing when I was about 10. And for me, it's just always been a way to like process my feelings, process my view of the world, and fears, right? I was a kid who really, I had a lot of fears growing up. So processing things that way on the page has just been, like you said, it's therapeutic. I never decided I wanted to go, and be a therapist, but I think writing and then, writing my own stuff, but then also trying to find opportunities where I can write in communities or have communities has just helped me grow as a writer and as a person, honestly, as well.
Mm. Yeah, it really sounds to me, Dawn, and I got this impression when I was researching for this conversation, how powerful it is to already have that pattern, if you like, in your muscle memory of using words, of using the page to process.
Yes.
Because if you don't have that pattern, when you do need to process something, you don't automatically reach for it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's
and also
true.
you had that love of storytelling.
Yes, absolutely. And I teach a lot of workshops on my own, and I co-teach with visual artists. And right now I teach through a program that's for older adults. So we go into community centers for older adults, and I consistently hear the participants start the workshops like, well, I can't draw, I can't paint, I can't write. It's been so long. And then we just, we'll share some poems or a short prose passage. I'll give them a prompt, and then they write these beautiful things. I'm like, yes, you are a writer. We are all writers, right? And our core, like we are just all at different parts of our creative journeys, because some of us have chosen to cultivate them and practice them while others don't. Like I couldn't go out and throw, three free throws in a row on a basketball court because I haven't practiced that, right? So it's really amazing to see where these individuals pull the stories from. And I'm thinking about one, and he's been in this program for a couple of years, and he's very quiet, and he'll say, I have nothing to say today. And I'll say, okay, but he has this patience to sit in that chair while other people are doing other things around him, whether writing, doing visual art, and he'll sit there with the prompt. And sometimes he'll write 2 lines, sometimes he'll write a paragraph. And it's always this beautiful sharing moment of his life with his family and his wife in particular. Like love, and I just said this to him last week, love is always present in his writing. So I think, I don't even remember where we started with this. I got on a tangent. I'm sorry. But it's just, I love the power of writing and storytelling, because we all have stories, right? We all have histories. And we all have interests that we can write about. Like to me, poetry is in the everyday life. It's, it's in making breakfast and doing dishes and getting into an argument and making up.
That's such a touching story about that chap in your writing group and
Yes.
that idea of love. Like, as I reflect on that, Dawn, you mentioned that he has the patience to sit. And I think that is absolutely essential. And I definitely have experienced in the past when I've had phases in my life when I've been quite stressed and I haven't been able to sit in that quiet way, and I haven't been able to feel that love or that sense of connection.
Yes.
So I definitely think that ability to sit patiently in that moment, sort of calmly with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And also, as you were talking, I was thinking to myself, we started this discussion with exploring writing process.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if part of developing a writing process is practicing allowing yourself to show up every day and just process something through your writing.
Oh, I like that. Yes. Yeah, I do really like that, because I think we live, in today's age, just everything is so fast paced, and everything's like get things done, move forward, measurement of success, right? And at least like when I was growing up, that was like the trajectory. And now I do see people coming back around more to like, okay, well, how can I process this day, and how can I find a container for these thoughts, for these emotions. And my container happens to be, writing. And I do definitely process daily life through writing. And I'm always thinking about it. And, you know, and I'll be walking, thinking about something else. My mind, I do have a hard time keeping my mind where my body is a lot of times. Like it's usually somewhere else. But when I do, those are the moments that I see like, oh my gosh, look at that dandelion growing right out of the root of a tree. And like, I'll take a picture and then I can kind of use that for writing to process later. And the sitting patiently, I think, is important, but I also think it's important to come back to that idea that we do go through phases of our lives where we might not be able to do that, right? And to be okay with that, because knowing that you can kind of come back around. I went through a separation after a long-term marriage, and I was not writing. And I was saying to my friends, I can't write. And they're like, it's okay. You can write later. You don't have to write today. And I had moved into a neighborhood. It was the first time I had ever lived alone as an adult. And I was running through these streets. And as I was running by these houses, these thoughts of the people who lived in the houses started coming into my head. And then I saw this front door that I can't even remember what color it was, but it was a really cool color. And I'm like, well, look at the color of that front door. And I literally sat down on the sidewalk with my phone and I started to write. And somebody came out of their house and said, are you okay? Did you fall? And I'm like, nope, it's okay. I'm okay. I'm just writing. And they're like, oh, okay. And they kind of like slowly backed into their house. So I think sometimes we have to give ourselves that space for it to be okay. Like, you spoke about shame. And I think there's so often times where like, if we're not doing it in the right time frame, in the right order, it's the wrong way to do it. And it's not necessarily the wrong way to do it. Sometimes you just need to kind of meander a bit to find your way.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out and sharing that personal story. I think it's such a beautiful example that we can change our process. Sometimes our process doesn't look like words on the page, but it sounds to me like you needed that almost that quiet to let your imagination almost like, I don't know, recover and find its feet again and then start getting curious about the world again.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. And also when you try other things, like right when you get stuck. And for me, it's movement. And when I say movement, it's not just, running, it's walking, it's hiking, it's cleaning. Like, I can get a really good draft of a poem when I'm vacuuming or dusting. So anytime like my body is in motion, so my brain can kind of do what it wants on its own. And so, especially when I lived in that neighborhood, I walked and ran a lot, and it was during COVID too. So I was out. I tried to get outside as much as I could, and yeah, and it definitely, those two things kind of really went together for me: the writing, the walking, and the writing.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Dawn, because I'm such an advocate of that necessity for movement. The energy center that we have just below our belly button is connected to movement. So if we're stationary or we're static or we're tense in our body, it can really block the energy in that area. And that's also connected to creativity. So it does make sense that if we're not moving our body, that energy center, which is about emotion and sensuality and feeling, it sort of can't be switched on. And so suddenly we stop feeling, we stop having those sensual, our senses, they can't come online. And I know that feeling. I sort of just feel dead. I'm like, oh, I've got no ideas. I'm not being curious about anything. And it feels really stagnant for me.
Yes, I've known that feeling, and it is so. And then it's always like that balance of, we're like, okay, well, you got to sit yourself in the chair and write and be creative, but you also have to move, right? So it's like going in between the two. So it kind of feeds that process. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I'm really glad that we're touching this, because I know that you were on that midday magic wellness summit. I think that was probably in January of this year. And you were talking, your session was put pen to paper, journaling to de-stress. declutter your mind, and develop a self-care practice. So
Yes.
I think the final thing I wanted to just touch on is this idea that when there's too much in the head, the ideas, the creativity, it sort of doesn't have that space. And I think that movement, and like you say, putting the pen to the paper to sort of get out the clutter, and the movement can sort of declutter. And then we do feel that sense of spaciousness. I think that sense of spaciousness, certainly for me, is so important.
I agree. And I had forgotten that was the title of the midday wellness magic. So thank you for that reminder. But it is like sometimes I think that the clutter in my head, whether it's writing related or life related or like both of them coming together, it does just kind of stagnate. And so, the movement has always been key for me. And even I think it always has been, but really in the last 8 or 10 years for me, it's, the older I get, the more I seem to crave that movement and need that to kind of feed the creativity as well.
Yeah. I find for me, either if I'm doing physical movement, or I might sit myself down and do quite an active breathing session.
Mm-hmm.
I find if I'm doing an active breathwork session, it gives the sense of movement because I'm breathing quite deep and heavily as if I were running. That can just literally send my fear away. It's kind of miraculous.
Well, I need to try breath work then, because I have not tried it on a consistent basis. And so that sounds
Ooh.
very promising.
Oh yeah, breathwork really has been a game changer for my writing process. Absolutely, hands down, without a doubt. I think what it does is it completely gets me out of that place when I'm in my head. Because I think when we're in that place of fear, yes, there are some anxious feelings in the body, maybe some tension, maybe a sense of the heart feeling out of rhythm or empty, but it's very much about the cyclical thoughts that are going on up here, the concerns about what might happen. Definitely, it's a very negative voice, isn't it? We're
Yes.
kind of berating ourselves for not writing.
Mm-hmm.
We're telling ourselves we're never going to make it. It's sort of like, my God, what's going to, I can't make this voice happy. But literally after a 55-minute active breathwork session, I'm just like,
Oh.
I'm a pure source of creativity. What was I even worrying about?
Well, I'm definitely going to try that and recommend it to other people who might be stuck as well. I often say, that negative voice, we all have it, and it's something that comes back around and around, right? I have not met a writer yet that says, "Oh, it's just gone," right? But I just say, let's just send it on a vacation, okay? Or send it out to the movies or do something like, it doesn't have to be, a 2-week vacation, but, a couple of hours will do for you to, to get something down on the page. But the breath work, that's really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So Dawn, you mentioned that sometimes you're processing stuff in your poems. It might be that you're processing experiences. I do get that sense of your poems. Sometimes there's an element of them being confessional. There's definitely an element of them being like mini stories, but almost a sense of not exactly as it happened, the sort of your experience of it. You're acknowledging, well, this is how it was for me, and you're acknowledging the feelings and lovely detail. And so I'm really curious, because this is something that I was thinking of as I was reading your work, and I was thinking about you as a writing coach, working with people developing a writing process. I'm curious about where that act of using writing to process experiences versus like writing as a creative endeavor, where, how or where that intersects.
I think that they're both always present for me. Like, I don't know if I ever sit down and be like, okay, this is just, I need to do some, like, I think I sometimes I'm like, okay, I'm just going to start to journal, and then I'll just start to write, and it will just start to be a poem. And part of my writing process over the last several years has been I tend to write in prose and then pull the poems out of it. And I didn't always do that. A friend of mine, a poet sister of mine who I just love and admire her work. We work in a group. There's 3 of us, and one writes in stanzas and the other one was just writing in prose. And then I had started doing that. And I find it to be freeing because I'm not trying to look at the craft elements of a poem. I'm just trying to sort through the idea of the poem, the story, because I write very narratively. My poems are kind of mini stories. And so it's just like, okay, what details are important to this poem, to get it from the beginning to the middle to the end. And I find writing it in prose and then going in and pulling it out and then making the determination of how I'm going to structure it, right? The scaffolding, so to speak. How many lines in each stanza? How many stanzas? Is it going to be a prose poem versus not? I do mainly write in free verse. I don't write a lot of formal poetry. So I think those 2 processes, they're just like always together. And then it's always me hopefully trying to check my perspective of the story I'm telling. Like I'm telling it truth to how I experienced it. Am I being honoring and respectful of the other people, even if I don't think that they always behaved wonderfully, right? If I'm putting that into a poem, I think I try very hard not to just point fingers. It's just like, I was in this experience. I brought my own things to this experience. And especially in the poems that I'm writing right now, I've been trying to be very careful about that because I'm telling my side of a story. And it's true and honest to who I am. But then it brings all of those other emotions, right? Some anger, some resentment, some shame, all of that stuff, that are all good topics for writing, right? I always say writing is not always puppies and rainbows. Like we kind of want to dig in and get our hands dirty. But so I think I'm always just kind of in that kind of zone, not necessarily always thinking, oh, okay, I'm going to now take this into a creative realm. It's just like, okay, here's something that happened. For whatever reason, it really struck me to the point where I feel like I want to write about it. So how do I take that story and then put it down on the page in a rough draft? And then how do I move it through revision after revision after revision to get to a point where I think, okay, this might be done, and I might start sending it out to literary journals. After I do have my 2 friends, we're in a writing group. We do share a lot of our work and get feedback before I send it out.
It's great to get that view of your process. It's making me again think about that place of fear that writers can find themselves in, where they don't even want to put anything on the page because it doesn't feel right.
Yes.
I don't know if you know what I mean, but there can be that sense if you're writing about personal experience, there's this sense of, I know what it's like in my head. I know how it feels. But the moment I think about writing it, there's this experience of, I'm not doing it justice, or that's not quite the way that I want to say it. And that can really block people. But it sounds with your process that you're just allowing yourself to get it on the page for that first draft.
Yeah, for the most part. I mean, I've had some poems I still do that are in progress. That's just like, I keep starting them and putting them aside, right? And starting them and thinking like, I really want to write about this, but I'll put something down. I'm like, that's not right. But I think that gets like into, for myself, like my own perfectionist tendencies. And like you said, it's not right. And then I have to remind myself that when I'm writing creatively, even if it's based in true story, because I write poetry, like I can fictionalize it and I can change some of the details. And I often do that. I was writing a story, a coworker and friend that I used to work with, she told me this incredibly personal story, a very powerful story, in a course of a conversation where I think she was saying to me, I'm not really like, I've never really done anything in my life, or like, I'm not strong. I'm not a strong person. I'm like, yes, you are. You just told me this story. And so I wrote the poem and I changed the details and I sent it to her because I was going to be reading it at a public forum where she was going to be in attendance. And I said, I want you to be comfortable with this. And she sent it back and she's like, can you change the details back? And so I did. So basically most of the poem, and it's in this collection, A Person Worth Knowing, are true stories, true to her. And it just like every time I I read that poem, I think of her, because it was, what she did was an incredibly strong act. And I just always
Is
want her
that
to
the
know that.
hoovering one?
It is. It is. It's the vacuuming one. Yes. So I know.
Yeah.
I know. Yeah. She's a tough cookie, as I said in the poem. Yes.
Let's go back to that feeling of it's not right. I think it's so important for us to just spend a moment here, because I think this could be really helpful for people listening. I have a sense through the trauma work that I do, when it comes to emotions, we can learn early on whether our emotions are right or wrong, acceptable or not acceptable. Okay.
Yes.
And I think that very much imprints on us, and it sets our relationship to our feelings. But I think as a writer, it can then set a certain relationship to our creativity, because creativity is linked to feelings. It's often a feeling that we're trying to write about.
Yeah.
So something I've been curious about recently, and you reminded me of it when I was listening to you, is this experience we have of that's not right, which can then make us want to drop the page and walk away. I'm wondering if what's happening in that moment is almost like a replay, where we're maybe expressing an emotion or entering into an area that at some point we were told that's not acceptable. This is not acceptable subject matter, or these feelings, I don't want to hear about them. And so we've kind of almost got this self-defense mechanism of like, hey, don't go there. And we sort of internalize that as a feeling of this isn't right, because at some point we were taught those feelings aren't right.
Yes.
I don't know. Does that resonate at all with you?
It does, to my core, actually. I think it just speaks to the person who I was and am, and I do think, like, and whether their messages are consciously given or subconsciously given, right? Because I do think that sometimes we get those messages subconsciously on the behalf of the other person, not even knowing that they're giving that to us. But I think somewhere along the line, I learned that it was not okay to be angry. And so, and to be the good girl, right? And the rule follower. And I know a lot of people get that message. And so, unpacking that in poetry has been, baby steps for me. I have not gone, full on into that. But I do think that it can be a stumbling block, right? It can be like that fear of, the fear of being judged, right, by what you're putting down on the page. That, like you said, it's not right to do. That's not the story. We don't tell stories of our families, all of that kind of stuff. And it's definitely a point, excuse me, where I think writers are just like, okay, well, I can't write, like, I think when people talk about writer's block, it's the fear, right? It's the fear of, I always say it's the fear of, the blank page, like just seeing this and like, how am I going to get everything that's up in here down on the page? It's the fear of being judged. It's the fear of not being good enough. That comparison, like you look at all of these, famous writers and look at how they write, and I can't possibly write like that. It's like, well, you're not them. It's okay. Like, you don't have to be them. You will be telling your story in your own, special lens. So I think that, trying to shed that it has to be right, it has to be just perfect on the page, is a good way to break through some creative blocks, and just realizing that whatever you're putting down on the page at first is going to be messy, and then I call it the messy middle too, right? And then you kind of like, you might get some steam going and you're trucking along, and then you get into this messy middle, like if you're in a longer piece and you're like, okay, there's a plot hole and I don't know how to fix it, or something like that. And then we have to sit in the mess. And I think that a lot of us have been taught, like, you need to keep things neat and tidy, and we're not going to get into the messiness of it all. And so all of those things I've they are muscles that I've had to build in my writing, and they are muscles that I continue to work on as I approach certain topics in my life, and And I think for me, and I have grown children, and they are the ones now that I think I'm most afraid of reading things, right? And if they heard me say that, they'd be like, "That doesn't matter, mom," right? And I have a son who's a writer, so he knows that, and so. But I still think that, like, I still want to make them proud. So I'm still trying to get over like that hump of they are just adults in and of themselves. And yes, I am their mother, but I have some stories to tell, and I'm going to tell them in the way that I need to tell them.
Such a beautiful share, Dawn. And I love that you acknowledged the challenging emotion of anger, because I think that is present for a lot of writers. Because I think that desire to write is often connected to a desire to express. And often that desire to express was at some point, I love the way you pointed out, either consciously or subconsciously not allowed.
Right.
And also the kind of the good girl, the, sticking by the rules as well. It made me reflect as well. I was sort of putting that alongside what you said earlier about, this isn't quite right. I don't know if you've ever done this. I used to do this all the time, where I might be telling someone how I felt and they weren't reacting in the way that I'd hoped. So then I would say, "Oh, no, wait, hang on. I'm not explaining myself correctly." And then I would explain it differently in a way that I thought was going to get a more positive response.
Yes.
And so I sort of learned to sacrifice like my true version and replace it with a version that I thought was going to be more well received.
Yes.
And again, I think that can feed into the writing process, where we might be expressing something that is true, but then we've got that habit of like, "Oh, wait, hang on. That's not right. I need to express it in this correct way that's going to please other people." Do you know does that make sense?
Oh, yes. Yes. I've had many of those conversations, those expectations that just get us, right? Like I go in thinking, okay, if I know this to be true, why can't this other person know it to be true, right? Or at least acknowledge that it's my truth. And I've had some very hard conversations where they just don't acknowledge it. And it's happened over and over with a particular instance in my life. And it's just like, why can't people see how I feel about this and respond what I deem to be appropriate, and so some of that has gone, into my writing. And I also once had somebody tell me that anger is a surface emotion. So they'd be like, "Well, what are you feeling underneath it?" And I'm like, this anger runs so deep. There is nothing under it. Like, this is all I have. So don't be asking me for anything else, because this anger is what I have. And so I think, in those moments too, I find myself second guessing myself and my feeling of it. It's like, I'm learning how to express anger, and here I am telling you I'm angry, and you're asking me what's below it. There is nothing below it. It's been there for so long that it's just stuffed. And my first chapbook is called "I Know When to Keep Quiet," and it's titled that for a reason.
Such a powerful title.
Thank you. And because I learned that very well, and I think at a very early age, I learned that. So yeah.
And actually, when we take that story, that share of yours, Dawn, I think there are a lot of writers in that position where perhaps they had that experience growing up, where they either had to keep quiet, or they weren't allowed to be the way that they wanted to be. They weren't allowed, the way that they wanted to express wasn't seen. And so we find ourselves later with this urge to let something out. And it feels very creative.
Yeah. I agree. And
this is so rich. Yeah, you were going to say something else.
I think just one more thing about anger. Like, again, all of these emotions that we put in like the negative column, right? And whenever I'm working with kids or adults, it's just like, these are valid, right? These are valid feelings to feel. It's how we process them. It's what we do with them that makes the difference in how we move through it. How, you feel it, you deal with it, and hopefully you can move on. Sometimes it takes several times of going through it over and over to get beyond the anger. But I think just in the writing is just, again, like just releasing a little bit more of that tension of where it is, right? And how deep the emotion runs for a particular memory or a particular occurrence in life. And I moved about a year and a half ago, and I have this box of journals. And so I was like going through the journals, and I said the same thing in these journals for about 15 years. And it was just like the same thread coming through over and over, sometimes in the same words, same phrases. And it's like, well, this is something that I need to kind of sit with and take a look at and see if it can find its way into my creative writing as well, or if they're just like need to be in a box, in a closet, never to be looked at again. Yeah.
That's definitely not the first time I've heard someone share an experience like that. I can certainly relate to it as well, looking back through my journals. And I'm curious, because if we think about that workshop that you were doing at the Wellness Summit, that sort of bringing to your journaling practice an awareness, a level of consciousness. I'm curious how someone, if we're talking about writing as a process, like allowing your writing to be a process, how might someone come to that process without just sort of dredging and cycling the same pains, the same worries, angers, woes, but find new levels of clarity? Would you suggest certain journal prompts, certain lengths of time? Like how, if you let's say if you were like, right, from now on, I'm going to really practice my journals and be conscious of where those cycles are. Like, how would you approach that?
Yeah, I think I would kind of try to look at a couple of different things, because I do think that once you start a practice of something, it doesn't mean that it will last forever. It might stop working for you, somewhere, along the way. So I think to get started, it would be like, okay, I'm going to journal for five minutes a day, or 10 minutes, 15, work your way up. Maybe give yourself time to read over the day before and see what you said, see if there's like one word that you can pick out of that one to bring into the current day, instead of like the whole baggage, right? Instead of the whole suitcase, just pick like an item out and carry it over. Definitely journal prompts. I think, if I know some people just approach things organically. Some people are definitely planners. So you could even plan your journaling routine if you want. You could look at a whole month and be like, on these days, I'm going to focus on writing about memories. On these days, I'm going to pick one word and journal about that one word. So I think it really depends on the person. And I think you can kind of really try different things and then just kind of keep a running list of the things that you've tried. Because just because they stop working in 1 month doesn't mean like the next year that you can't pick that back up and be like, oh, I think I'm going to try that. And that might, help me process through things. Excuse me. I do have handwritten journals, but I also use an app called Day One. And I've been using that since 2017. And what I love about Day One, because it's electronic, when you open it, it says on this day, and it can show you everything that you did on the previous years if you wrote on that day. So it kind of can show you like your consistency if you're writing every day. But you can also use, you can upload photos. And if you do the paid version, you can upload videos. And so I do upload video. I don't upload videos. I upload pictures. And then the journaling I do in there is a lot of dream journaling. I'm just recording dreams because I dream in detail and long dreams, and usually about my days, because I want to record a certain day. And that's been a gift, going back and seeing like different trips that I've taken where I've just taken like a couple of like, here's what we did, or here's where we ate, or I had like a wonderful crepe in Paris, or, something like that. So sometimes it can just be like fun kind of journaling like that. If you don't want to delve, too deep into emotions, just what did you do today? You can list the whole day, or you can list just one or two things that was really, exciting. Like my niece plays softball, and she just had her 200th career strikeout, and I didn't get to see it in person, but I got to see it on video. So, that will go in my journal. So next year I'll be like, oh yeah, Emily did that. That was so cool that she did that last year. So things like that.
I love the sound of that. And also, I really felt drawn to what you said earlier on, where you might journal one day and then the following day to actually look back on it.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And then pick out a word, because I think in the act of looking back, you can sort of become more conscious rather than in this kind of sleepwalking state of the world is out to get me. Things are not going the way that I want them to go. If I sort of read a page that said that, I'd be like, oh my gosh, is that really what I think? And then to pick out a word and explore that. I love that suggestion. I'm quite tempted to do that myself, Dawn.
Yeah. Well, now that I said it, I think I'm going to do that with one of my writing groups and my older adults. So I think that would be a good one for them, and see where they can take that as well. And then, of course, you can also do a gratitude journal, right? You can just list 3 or 5 or 10 things. Make just a list. It doesn't have to be, in complete sentences. You can just write in phrases. You can do visual journaling too. Like if you just want to doodle your way through. I've seen those a few places, and I'm like, that's really interesting to just kind of doodle. And how would that be represented if I don't consider myself, a visual artist? How would I doodle a day? So I think, and then how could you add words, to the doodle as well?
Oh, this is so fun. I love all these ideas. It's bringing to mind a couple of things that you've already said. The sense that I'm getting, Dawn, that you truly believe that writing is this craft that you've got to hone. You talked about building a muscle. You've talked about practice, because I think there is this misconception of we pop out of the womb as fully formed writers, and if we can't get it in our first draft, it means that we don't have it. But I love certainly looking at some of your content, your work as a writing coach, the sense I really get that the more you practice, the better you're going to get. One thing I'm curious about, Dawn, is certainly in my experience, working with writers, independently working with MA students, sometimes we can be practicing and it can keep us stuck. We're sort of practicing bad habits. And sometimes we can be practicing in a way that is stretching us and is growing us. I'm curious if that's anything that you've noticed as well, and how you might really explain to someone, this is the kind of practice that you want to do if you want to grow and improve and refine yourself as a writer.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I always tell people, and it might sound cliched, but is to keep an open mind. Like if I have somebody who has hired me to work with them, either to do a manuscript critique or to, create a practice, right? Get them in a consistent, accountable way of writing and submitting their work. It's just like, keep an open mind to my suggestions. In the end, we all have our own agency, and we all have like our own compass inside to be like, oh, I don't really like how she changed that phrase or suggests that I change that phrase, but I'm going to try it anyway. So it's to keep an open mind. So like when I give comments to people, it's usually like I suggest or I encourage. I don't I stay away from, you should do this. Now, there are certain craft elements, and, that if you're trying to form something structurally that we, often need to follow. But within that, I just say, just keep an open mind. And here are things that I see that you're doing repetitively. And maybe in the next version, try to break that, right? Try to, and also learn the rules, follow the rules, practice the rules, and then break the rules. And I say that to students, from 5 to, there's one person in our group right now who's 102. It's like, we can break the rules, like that they're there, but let's break them. So if I'm telling you, I want you to write a haiku, and a haiku has certain, things that you need to follow. But you decide, I'm not going to do that, and I'm going to put 12 syllables on a lot, like, have at it, right? Because you're still creating and you're still putting words down on a page. And to me, that's a success when they can get to that point where they're like, oh, I'm going to break the rules. Or sometimes they won't even follow the prompt. And I love that. I call it going off road. It's just like, you've just gone off on your own and you've decided what you want to write about, and you go and come back when you want to tell us the story. And so I think mostly it's like it's an open mind, but that also takes a level of trust, right? When you're working with somebody else, because you're, you know, whether you're a new writer or a seasoned writer, there's still a vulnerability in sharing a story for the first time, right? Sharing a very raw, rough draft with somebody else to get comments back on. It's like, okay, well, I'm putting myself out there. So, so it's that balance. And I think that that takes a while to create, in a coaching, environment.
Yeah. And I tell you what's coming to mind, Dawn, this idea of having that open mind and also experiencing that vulnerability. I remember early on in my 20s, I had a meeting with a very renowned literary agent who was interested in representing me in my novel. And he had some suggestions. And at that point, I was not self-aware. I was not clued up on how I was actually sabotaging myself. I wasn't able to have an open mind because unconsciously I didn't believe I was good enough. And so actually, unconsciously, I didn't believe that I would be able to do what he was suggesting and that he would then lose interest in me as a client. I was like, he's got really famous clients on his list. My version of his edits are going to be so rubbish. And so at that point in my writing career, it's not that I didn't like people's suggestions. I was just like, I don't know if I can even do them.
Yes.
And I certainly had to do a lot of healing work to really come into those unconscious beliefs and see how they were controlling me. But then what I also had to do was to just go through a phase of trying everyone's suggestion. Right. I was like, a bit like what you were saying earlier, when you first write a poem, you put all the prose on the page and then you kind of pick out. I was like, do all of the suggestions and then that was so healing for me, Dawn, because it gave me the opportunity to write almost in somebody else's voice or write a version of a story that I would never come up with myself. And I think it really freed me as a writer and has made me a lot more flexible as a writer. So that open mind is now possible.
I think that's lovely that you recognized in your 20s. So you said you weren't self-aware, but I think that on some unconscious level, you might have been, because you're like, I don't know if I can do this. Like, I don't know if at this time in my life, I have that skill set. But then you kept moving forward and you kept writing, right? And trying it. May I ask, did you stay with that agent, or was that something that you had to move on from? And you don't have to answer if you don't want.
No, well, I just love your comment that you were like, oh, I think you were self-aware. Actually, Dawn, so here's what happened. Okay. I just ghosted them because I wasn't self-aware and I just completely unconsciously sabotaged it.
Yes. Yeah.
So I remember just being in a real place of terror. I do remember thinking that at some point they were just going to stop returning my emails because they were more focused on their more important clients. I do remember thinking that, and then just completely unconsciously sabotaging it. And then I ended up going with a different agent. So I think that unconscious sabotage shows up in the writing process so much. I mean, I can see now, I've just completed a novel now, the whole process I'm going through is so completely different.
Yeah.
But that's because of a couple of decades of healing work.
Exactly. Congratulations on finishing another novel. I mean, I just love when I hear people just how they work through it and you grow, right? It's, like you said, it's practice. The more you do something, the easier it might get. And, And that unconscious sabotage, I think, happens more often than we even realize in so many different ways. So, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Dawn, this has been so delicious chatting with you. I feel like I could make myself a cup of tea and carry on for another hour. But I know that you've got things to get on with.